Hi, my name is Melissa Barnes, and I will be talking to you about a little bit about qualitative methods and also be talking about data collection in both quant and qual. And this is topic 5. As Sarah mentioned earlier, I'll tell you a little bit about myself because I didn't do that previously. I'm originally from the States, if you didn't catch that yet. So I studied to be an elementary school teacher, or in other words, a primary school teacher. And I taught in primary for several years, and then I became very interested in language, and particularly English as an additional language. And also because at the time I spoke Spanish, and I was very interested in language as a whole and teaching abroad. So I then spent a lot of time abroad. I spent 5 years in Vietnam. I spent time in Germany, in Chile, in South America. So all these experiences collectively kind of help shape my understanding of language and literacy and education. So my research kind of lies within not only English as an additional language, but more broadly assessment and curriculum. So I've done a few projects. More recently, I worked on the EAL curriculum for VCAA for the primary years. And my research looks at, I have a project going at the moment that is looking at the literacy and numeracy test that you will all be taking, and looking at, does it discriminate particular types of students and so on. So these are the sorts of research things that I've been doing. I've also, and while this lecture won't really talk about action research, I've dabbled in a bit of action research, but most of my research is in qualitative. Though there has been some mixed method sorts of things that I've done. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of who I am. So just briefly on qualitative designs. Now your textbook will really talk a lot about qualitative designs, but I'm just going to talk basically briefly about ethnographic studies and case studies, and Louise will be looking at action research and possibly also about design-based research, which is kind of been born from the action research movement of design-based research, which looks at collaboration between researchers and schools, and teacher researchers and schools. So ethnography is defined as a method of observing human interactions in social settings and activities. And the idea of ethnography is really to kind of look at the day-to-day activities, but in like a detailed description. It's not just, oh, I'm going to come in for these lessons and observe, but a lot of ethnographies that have happened in the school, I mean, these are years that, the researcher has gone in and been kind of a part of that community and really observed everything that was happening. And it actually you end up with quite a lot of data. But part of that is also recording the stories and the narratives and myths and so on, particularly if you're looking at a culture and you're investigating kind of the beliefs and the activities of a particular culture. So the main characteristics are things like capturing the insider's viewpoint. So the idea is to try to, because this is the thing is, as a researcher, particularly as a teacher researcher, you have a sense of, particularly at your classroom, you already have a viewpoint. But a lot of times researchers have you don't want to show bias, so they're very much outsiders. So it's being able to kind of take away all of the bias that you already have and being able to see things from the insider's viewpoint. And that develops over time to really be able to understand and take away kind of what you understand yourself already, so your viewpoints and your perspective, but really being able to understand and capture the insider's viewpoint. As I mentioned, usually ethnographies are conducted over a long period of time, and they do not start with a pre-existing hypothesis, but kind of begins with some kind of general ideas that they're looking for or constructs. And then they allow the data to gradually narrow their focus. So the idea is to gather a lot of data and then really kind of hone it in and then narrow their focus as they go on. In ethnographic research, researchers need to investigate the setting and participants in advance. So they need to understand, and there's some sensitivity in this, understand the organization policies, the working culture and history and so on. So there's a bit of sensitivity that's involved in ethnography because you really become part of that community, and it's being able to kind of to understand how that works and be sensitive to those sorts of things instead of being this kind of distant yet not understanding kind of the insides of that particular setting. The other thing that's important in ethnography is being detailed in the fieldwork, so recording everything from the observations and interviews. So not just kind of what happened, but also feelings and impressions and questions. So there's, like I said, there's a lot of data involved. Now, case study research, this is probably the method that I'm most familiar with. I've done a lot of case studies, and this usually focuses on a person or place, for example, a classroom or school, or thing, and it's suited to how and why questions. And this is where you start connecting your, so if you've decided, oh, I want to do qualitative, or maybe you haven't gotten that far, but you started with your question, and you have how, and you're asking questions like about how and why. You already are leaning towards this particular type of research. Now, the nature of this particular project, you have, most of you will be collecting your data from a school. So case study fits quite nicely. So you're either doing an action research project, or you're doing a case study. And that can be kind of in three ways. There's the descriptive, so you're describing you describe in order for others to understand the context. You're describing what's happening in the classroom. Explanatory, so explaining why things are the way they are. And evaluative, so evaluate how well something is. So if there's a particular program, evaluating how well it does or is. So case study research is common in educational research. It's obviously not the only method, but it is very common, particularly because the classroom or the school becomes a very bound case, and a place to kind of ask those how and why questions, and particularly as we are kind of investigating why teachers do certain things, or why students do, and how how learning occurs and so on. Those questions very much kind of are situated often in education contexts. So here are some of the advantages and disadvantages of case studies. And the advantages are that it's real world data, so it's actually classroom data. If the case is the classroom. You can discover new ideas and concepts. And this is the thing that's really important, is it provides in-depth understanding of people in a setting. So the idea is that you're really exploring and investigating, people's perspectives and beliefs and attitudes in regards to that particular context. And while there's a little bit of that of like an ethnography, you don't actually have that in a case study because you just don't have the time. So my doctorate was a case study that I looked at some schools in Vietnam, and obviously I wasn't spending a whole year just looking at, every day going to these classes and observing and collecting data based on their daily activities, but I had a certain kind of time frame that I went in and I collected my data. So that was much more of a case study than it could ever be in ethnography. Some of the disadvantages is that the context too specific. So, in my context, there were 4 schools. Now, that's not generalizable to all schools in Vietnam. So it is because it gets data that is very specific to a context, that's the purpose. It's not trying to generalize. That's not the purpose of it. It's trying to explore and find out more about a particular context. It does tend to take a bit more time and money, particularly if you're doing, and we'll talk about the methods, but the data collection methods. But if you're doing interviews, you have to transcribe those interviews. So you type out word for word what those interviews, and that can take a long time. So it can take some time and money. And then the data is messy. It takes a long time to kind of structure it in a way that makes sense. So the main thing is that case studies are not necessarily generalizable, so you can't necessarily say that what happened in one school is going to happen with all schools. So these are some commonly used data collection methods, so quantitative and qualitative. And you'll see how, depending on what your question and your paradigm, whether it's quant or qual, and we use those terms quant and qual just because we're a bit lazy, but quantitative and qualitative, that some of these methods are used for both, but obviously how you structure them and the questions that you ask are very, very different. So I'm going to mainly talk about 4 different data collection methods. So we have observations, which are field notes and reflections, interviews, surveys, and artifacts such as documents and visual data. So observations, it's important, first of all, with observations that you're organized so you can capture as much information as you can in real time, because this is the thing, is that when you try to capture everything, you don't. You're one person. So it's sometimes very good, particularly if you're only observing for a certain amount of time, that you're very specific about what information you're collecting. The other thing is that you need to identify what data you want collected. So for a project that I did, I looked at activity types. So I was looking at a classroom, and it was a English as an additional language classroom. So I was looking at what kinds of activities they were doing, what kind of resources they were using, how often were the students interacting among, with others, how much time was, so participant organization, how much was the teacher in charge, how much students were in charge, and how much time was spent on each activity, and so on. So I had a very specific kind of scheme, observation scheme, to kind of identify these things. And for me, that was then actually quantitative, in that I was able to look at the percentage of time. So how much time was spent on listening, how much time was spent on speaking, how much time was spent with teacher instruction, how much time was spent with students in groups. So I was able to then be able to look at a whole range of different classrooms that I'd observed, and be able to kind of show a snapshot through numerically on what time, where time was being spent. In observations, notes and codes are often used so that you can try to write down as much as possible, and then they will become full descriptions later. So this is an example of that. So let's say this is a very simple kind of observation, note-taking exercise. And let's say I have 4 categories. I have a time, I have participants, activity, and notes. So I'm observing a classroom, and from 10 to 10:15, it's the whole class. And the teacher is reading Brown Bear, that was it, Brown Bear on a mat. And so the notes is that student 1 is pulling student 2's hair. Student 1 sits in the back, and teacher says nothing. Okay, so this is what I observed. Another one is from 10 to 12, and then I'm looking at the participants, who's doing what, and so on. So maybe I'm looking at positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement, and I'm actually looking at the frequency of how often the teacher gives positive or negative reinforcement, and what that actually entails. So that's another, way to then, with the time you can quantify that, but also it gives you some really rich qualitative data in regards to what's actually happening in the classroom, and possibly why. Field notes and journals. I think it's actually it's just a good habit to get into, is to reflect on what's happening. In your placement next semester, you won't have as much observation. I think a lot of you will go straight into teaching full time. But when you get a chance to be able to reflect, and not only reflect on what's happening, but then what your impressions were about it. But also, and that's really a hard thing to do, is to be able to observe objectively and then actually put your comments, because it's very easy to say, the teacher told the boy to stop talking because she doesn't like him. Well, that's quite, it may have been because something happened. So trying to not be biased in your actual reflections. It's okay to actually give impressions on things, but to actually your observations, to make sure that they don't actually include any bias. So not only write your observations, but your reflections, and ask questions. So, asking questions like, oh, this was really interesting, I wonder why that was, just to kind of help direct you when you go back into the data. The other thing about field notes and journaling is that you can make links to other data sets. So if you're going to be reflecting on what's happening in the classroom, you link it to, work samples, and then you collect those that data as well. I'm just going to give you a student example here, and this is how a student took their reflective journal and used it as data for their project. So whilst on my professional placement, many notes were taken demonstrating just how curriculum-focused learning was within the primary school. So to give you a little background, this student was an early years teacher and is now transitioning into primary years. So she was really interested in this idea of what are the differences. So she's this is part of her we're going to talk about her reflection, but this is part of her paper. The curriculum focus was new due to my experience within the early childhood field, and much uncertainty was felt. This can be seen in the following examples taken from my reflective journal in the first week. And here she has specific things that she'd written down, and so she's trying to make the point that, you know, her experience, there was a lot of uncertainty, and particularly it was surrounding curriculum, because in the early years, the curriculum is very different from in the primary years, and everything seemed to be so curriculum focused. And for someone that wasn't used to that in the early years, it was quite hard. And so she then takes snapshots from the reflective journal as evidence to explain how this process works. She was looking at a reflective process of her own experience moving from early years to primary. Interviews. Why would we use interviews? I mean, the first reason would be to explore the meanings made by individuals. So what are, what does this mean to particular individuals? And then explore their perceptions, beliefs, values, and opinions. Just because a teacher says that little Jimmy isn't smart because doesn't necessarily mean it. This is the thing, is that all teachers will have their perspective on things. It doesn't mean that it's definitely what's happening. And that's where it's always good to what we call triangulate. So you observe things, you interview, because we all have just a perspective on things. So collecting different perspectives kind of help us then make sense of observations that we've made. But it doesn't necessarily mean that their perceptions or their beliefs or values are correct, but the idea is that we're exploring them. What are they? What do they think about this? And then what's actually happening in the classroom? And is there a mismatch, or do those things actually speak to one another? The other thing is we use interviews to document individual historical accounts or narratives. Okay, so there's a lot of research that really like the idea of a narrative, and in some ways your research is a narrative. It's kind of looking at your own experience as a teacher researcher, and interviews can often be used to look at someone's narrative and how their process through something. Interviews need to be carefully organized in regards to time and place. So first of all, 1 hour of interview can be a day transcribing. So, if you kind of have these really great ideas that I'm going to interview like 5 teachers and it's going to be an hour each, you're going to have a lot of data. So not only is that really important in regards to transcribing, but it's also important because you need to be respectful of people's time. I don't think if you tell your mentor teacher, oh, okay, I want to interview for an hour, that they're going to be very up for that. So really, ideally keep interviews from, 10 to 15 minutes at the most. Okay. Have focused, relevant, and open-ended questions, and make sure you trial them. So it's important to make sure that you actually maybe just check with someone, ask those questions, make sure they make sense, and make sure they're open-ended. Don't ask yes or no questions. Listen. That's the other thing, is listen and don't interrupt. It sounds very simple, but you'd be surprised. Okay. Now, creating questionnaires and surveys. Now, this is a question that people often ask, what is the difference between a questionnaire and a survey? Well, survey, you can survey, and it's more kind of like questionnaire as a subset of survey. A lot of people use these interchangeably, but the idea is the questionnaire is actually the tool, it's actually the thing, it's the piece of paper, that's the questionnaire. When you survey, you can do that, it's kind of the general idea that you're surveying people, but the questionnaire is the actual tool, the actual piece of paper that you're using or online tool that you're using. But to be honest, most people use them interchangeably, so don't stress too much about that. But it seems that everybody always asks that question. So common response types are the Likert scale. So usually people use a 5-point or a 3-point. So it'll be from strongly agree to strongly disagree. So if it was only 3-point, there would be strongly agree, neutral, and strongly disagree. And then you'd have strongly agree, somewhat agree, neutral, so on. So you have that, and then you have the never to frequently as well. So never, sometimes, actually never, never, rarely, sometimes, usually, and frequently. Those are the type of words that you might use to get students or participants to then kind of say, this is how frequently I do something. Multiple choice, that's another, and then you have to decide, is it a single or a multiple response? So is there only one answer that they can choose, or can they have multiple responses? And then, or a written response. So you see that with the Likert scale and the multiple choice, that is much more quantitative, getting information and getting percentages of this many people said this, and so on. While a written response is obviously going to be data that you're going to have to analyze and look at the themes involved in that. Be reasonable with time expectations. Don't write a 30-question questionnaire. If you want people to take it, you need to say, this will only take you 5 minutes, and it really needs to just take 5 minutes, because nobody wants to spend a lot of time on a questionnaire. The other thing is ensure you know what data you want to collect. So do you need demographics, and why? Like why are you asking them to tell you if they're an English speaker or not, or if they're male or female? That's fine. But if you're going to use it, don't ask it if you don't actually need that data. So ask why you're actually needing to collect that data. What categories of information, or do you want categories, or do you want specific information? And then obviously you need to decide, are you looking at this, do you just want the percentages and numbers? Or do you want, the written responses, the narratives, the stories that you can actually then look at, the perspectives? Or is it going to be a mixture? And the funny thing is a lot of my research is mixture. I've done a lot of surveys that can kind of do a broad snapshot of a wider population, and then I take from that and I look at very specific perspectives on that. The other thing is you need to make sure that that you protect and this is the ethics part of it, that you protect your participants. And one way is to make sure that they can remain anonymous. So there is an online program called Qualtrics, and you will get to play around with that a little bit in your tutorials. And there's other programs like Qualtrics that allow you to send an anonymous link. So that means that it doesn't collect anyone's email and so on. And that's really important. Even for me, if I'm doing a survey, I'll look to see if it's anonymous and so on. Also because I don't want to be sent a whole bunch of emails, like someone collects my email, where is that going? And if you're going to make paper questionnaires available, make them available in the staff room. So teachers can complete and place in a designated folder or box. So you might, first you check with your mentor teacher, and or a principal, and and that's an opportunity to kind of talk to the principal about your research and see what they suggest. But one thing that students have done is in the staff room there is a box that says please place your completed questionnaire here. So you need to think about that, and you need to make sure that you're not having teachers come and give you the questionnaire, because then who they are, and it's a bit awkward. So just make sure that you think through the ethics of that. Here are some advantages and disadvantages of questionnaires, and that's advantages. It can easily be applied with a large number of participants. So a recent study I did, we looked at, I think we got 119 respondents of a questionnaire. So it was quite good because it gave us a broad range of participants. And so in that way, it's a powerful and informative snapshot of what that particular population thinks about something in particular, or several things. If repeated, changes in patterns can be monitored and explanations sought. So for me, I think questionnaires are actually, and a lot of people use them this way, as kind of the springboard. So it's a way to kind of get some information, and then you go, oh wow, this is really interesting. How many people, like this, the project that I was talking about, we were looking at teachers and those who are using these tools that the government had spent a lot of money providing sustainability tools for students to use, and they had promoted it to the principals, but what happened was that many of the teachers didn't actually know about it. So I think 75% of the respondents had no idea that this tool existed, which was slightly unnerving. But then that helped us ask questions. Well, why wasn't actually why didn't the teachers know about it? How was it advertised? How was it sold to the schools? So that kind of sent off some ideas on future projects that we could do. Some of the disadvantages is that often, particularly if it's quantitative, there's no explanation, but there's always that option. You can always have a question and then say, explain your reason for your answer. So you can do that. Careful design and valid interpretations are critical. So it's not really a disadvantage, it's just kind of a warning. I think I've read a lot of bad questionnaires, so you really do need to trial it and make sure that the questions make sense and it's clear and there's one answer, or if it's multiple answers, that you've said there are multiple answers to this question, or you can choose multiple answers to this question. And then, considering sampling. So how are you just emailing this questionnaire to your friends who all think the same as you, or, and so on. So that's an important thing to consider. Documents and work samples. So again, documents can help to triangulate your interviews and or questionnaires. So, these can be student works or documents like policies. So policies that the school have. So maybe you're looking at something on English as an additional language and you actually look at their website to see, are there any kind of resources available? Or you talk with the teacher, what kind of resources are being used? So those documents, particularly if they're public, are really powerful and easily accessed. So examples, curriculum framework. So you have the curriculum, you have the school's philosophy, mission, purpose statement, the school's strategic plan, and examples of program planning. So questions to consider when you're looking at these documents are, when were they created? Who created them? Why were they created? So what's the purpose? And how do these documents link to your other data? Okay, and then work samples. And student work samples can be really powerful, but you need to be careful and you need to make sure you talk with your mentor teacher, because you need to make sure you have permission. Now, sometimes these samples can be de-identified by your mentor teacher, and so then you don't actually know who they are, but you need to make sure that you protect the students and so on, so you make sure you get the correct permission that you need. And there'll be another week that we talk more about permission and consent. The other thing is that student work samples can be used to compare different students' work or show improvement or change in a particular student's work. And there's ways, while most people think of this as a very qualitative, so you're looking at their work and you're commenting and you're looking at patterns, there's a way to quantify using a word count. So maybe you're looking at how many times did the students use high frequency words versus content words, or how many simple sentences do they use in comparison to complex sentences. So there are ways to quantify it. And I think that's the idea, is that you need to kind of figure out what data you want to find, but there's often ways, depending on what paradigm you've chosen, whether you're going to kind of look at it more quantitative or qualitatively. The last thing that I want to mention is visual data. So visual data can be very powerful, particularly like learning environments, but you need to make sure that you don't get the faces of people and no children. So unless you have permission. And you can take photos, but you can take photos of environments, or let's say there's like a word wall, something like that, or something you've planned. But you just need to make sure that you get permission. Now that's a lot, and I've tried to go through that very, very quickly, but just kind of a taste of not only qualitative, and Louise will continue to talk more about action research and so on, but just a taste of that, but also kind of data methods that you could possibly consider in your own research, but also to know that a lot of these methods we use both for quantitative and qualitative. So we often, people make this big divide between qualitative and quantitative, but actually sometimes we use a lot of the same methods, but we really have to understand why we're collecting the data we're collecting and what we're actually trying to get out of it. Have a great week. Thanks. Bye.